Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Welcome to the JCA. My name is Ilana Gilg. I'm the program director here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this fantastic program tonight. We are just absolutely thrilled with the guests that we have presenting for you today. I wanted to make a few quick announcements. The first is that we have bathrooms just across the hall. If anyone needs them, please feel free to get up at any time. We also have refreshments in the back. Please help yourselves to those during the presentation if you would like. The format is going to be about 45 minutes of speaking, followed by a Q&A and then a reception. And lastly, since this is the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht, I just wanted to share a poem that I received this morning from the fabulous poet, Anna Robel, who is in the audience today, that I just felt completely summed up the mood today on this particular occasion and in this time. It's called Cleaning Day. Glass and feathers, feathers and glass. One that shattered what was safe, one blew comfort in chaos away. Glass and feathers, feathers and glass. Smashed were the windows, torn were the pillows and blankets of down. Mountains of shards, a naked fear beyond, blinds and panes once private and clear. While piles of fluff, once light and white, grow brown and gray amid streets in decay. And who must clean all the garbage away? Women and girls left to themselves when 30,000 men were dragged off that day. Glass and feathers, feathers and glass. Sharp biting corners covered in clouds of migrating down, raining from windows to fall to the ground. Every footfall a billowing crush into the rush of a menacing death. And always it's women who must clean up the mess. Glass and feathers, feathers and glass. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Debbie Smith, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Smith, and I would like to welcome those of you in the room and those of you on Zoom on behalf of the Beth Israel congregation in Bath. We are thrilled to be partnering with the JCA today. And at the outset, I want to thank Janet Marstein and Marilyn Weinberg, neither of whom unfortunately could be here today, as well as Ilana and Sam and the rest of the JCA staff that have made this event a reality. This event highlights the importance of speaking out, standing up, and taking action against intolerance, hatred, and oppression, whether against Jews or any targeted group or individual. The timing of today's presentation on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, while the sting of our own country's shift toward dictatorship, intolerance, and hatred is so fresh, it reminds us of our responsibility to look for opportunities to support and partner with the marginalized. Today, we will see how just the actions of just one person, Feng Shan Ho, saved the lives of thousands while risking his own personal safety and livelihood. He serves as a role model for all of us as we face the challenges of the future. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Manli Ho. But before Manli begins, I want to give a little background on how we got to this afternoon's presentation. Every few months, Beth Israel sponsors what we call a community read, where we announce a book that members can read and then discuss as a group. About a year ago, we read a book called The Last Kings of Shanghai by Jonathan Kaufman about two Jewish Baghdadi families who left the Middle East in the middle of the 19th century due to fear of persecution and limitations placed on Jews by the Ottoman Empire. These families ultimately found their way to Shanghai and Hong Kong, where they became two rival dynasties involved in the evolution of China. Fast forward from the 19th century to the 20th century, when the Nazis under Hitler began systematic persecution of the Jews in Europe. These two families in Shanghai received and managed the influx of thousands of Jewish refugees who had escaped through the efforts of one man, Feng Shan Ho. Ho, a Chinese diplomat in Vienna, risked his life and career issuing visas to Austrian Jews, allowing them to escape. Shortly before the discussion of Kaufman's book at the temple, I learned that incredibly, this Chinese hero's daughter, Manli Ho, lived locally and had actually visited Beth Israel about 20 years ago to talk about her father. Thinking that it would be fascinating to hear her perspectives again, we invited her to join our discussion group. Although she was unable to attend at that time, she graciously offered to speak about her father, his legacy, and her thoughts on similarities between her father's time and the fraught times we find ourselves in now. Which brings us to today's event. We are thrilled to have Manli Ho with us. She has spent the past 2 decades researching and documenting the history of her father's rescue activities. A journalist by trade, Manli was a member of the Boston Globe team that earned a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of school desegregation in Boston in the 70s. And in 1981, she helped found China Daily, China's national English language newspaper. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Manli Ho.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming on this beautiful day, which could be well spent outside. And I thank the people online who are joining us from all over the world. Some of them it's probably the middle of the night for some of them. And moreover, I would like to thank Debbie Smith and Marilyn Weinberg of the Beth Israel Congregation in Bath, and Ilana Gilg and Sam, and the staff of the Jewish Community Alliance for making this afternoon possible. On November 9 and 10, 1938, the Nazis orchestrated an overnight anti-Jewish rampage in Germany and Austria, which became known as Kristallnacht, the infamous night of broken glass, so called because Jewish-owned stores were destroyed. Their shattered glass from the storefront windows littered the streets. Hundreds of Jewish synagogues, like the Temple Gaza in Vienna, Austria, were set on fire, and 30,000 Jewish males between 16 and 64 were rounded up and deported. This was a deportation to Mauthausen, to concentration camps such as Dachau and Buchenwald, where these men whose heads have already been shaved are still lined up in their civilian clothes. Today is the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which the late historian Sir Martin Gilbert called the prelude to the destruction of Europe's Jews. The architect of this was Adolf Hitler, a demagogue who was elected to leadership in 1933 because he appealed emotionally to the German people who were angry about economic depression and post-war humiliation by promising that he would make Germany great again with a Third Reich that would last 1,000 years. Today, 5 days out of a presidential election here in America, the same America, which was a bulwark in the fight against fascism and authoritarianism, Americans have again elected Donald Trump, a demagogue, to be president of the United States. The Spanish philosopher George Santayana said, "Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it." So, as we plunge further into a dark, divisive, dangerous, and uncertain future, I think we need to be reminded of the past. Today, I would like to share with you the history of how my late father, the Chinese diplomat Dr. Feng Shan Ho, responded 8 decades ago to a cataclysmic time which increasingly parallels ours. It was shortly after my father's death in 1997 that I first began, by chance, to chase down a very cold case, the untold story of my father's diplomatic tenure in Vienna, Austria from 1937 to 1940. As I waded deeper into these unknown waters, the story became panoramic and grew to encompass the hitherto unchronicled history of escape from a genocide in Europe and how the actions taken by my father, one of the earliest foreign diplomats to rescue Jews, provided a refuge of last resort on the other side of the world, in China. This is my father's diplomatic passport, and over there in the corner, you can see the stamp of the Third Reich with the eagle and the swastika. It has since taken me a quarter of a century of research and documentation to piece together and fully grasp this enormously complex historical puzzle, which spanned the wars, the politics, and cultures of people of 3 continents, especially since during his lifetime, my father rarely spoke of his time in Vienna, and much less about his efforts in the mass rescue of Jews. My father told me only 2 anecdotes from that era. One was of his witnessing Hitler's triumphant march into Vienna following the Anschluss, or the union of Austria and Germany into the Third Reich in March 1938. My father recounted how appalled he was by the fanatical welcome, such as these women cheering, these welcoming crowds at Vienna City Hall, and even the famous Vienna's Boys Choir saluting under a banner saying, "We sing for Adolf Hitler." Overnight, a reign of terror descended upon Austria's 185,000 Jews, the 3rd largest Jewish population in Europe. Jews were forced to scrub the streets with acid. They were immediately stripped of any rights by the Nuremberg laws. Jewish stores were branded with the word Juden, and even a park bench was marked only for Aryans. In Nazi racial ideology, human beings were collectively classified into races. The putative Aryan race, blonde, blue-eyed white Germans, were considered a superior master race. Jews were a priority enemy, and other groups, the Romani or Gypsies, Slavs, Africans, Asiatics, the disabled, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses were all considered racially inferior subhumans who were only suitable for imprisonment, slave labor, and extermination. The second story my father told me was a more personal one, and it occurred on Kristallnacht. On the morning of November 10, my father faced down the Gestapo to save his Jewish friend, an oil company executive named Rosenberg, whose first name has been forever lost to history, who had been arrested and would have been deported to a concentration camp had my father not intervened. It was a vivid story to a child, and even though I did not understand then the context of this story, my father's lesson was well understood, that one should stand up for what is right, help those in distress, and not cave in to bullies, not even at gunpoint. In his memoirs, 外交生涯40年, or 40 years of my diplomatic life, my father would write a mere 70 Chinese characters about how he responded during this terrible period. He wrote, "Since the Anschluss, the persecution of the Jews by Hitler's devils became increasingly fierce. The fate of Austrian Jews was tragic, persecution a daily occurrence. I kept close touch with an American relief organization, which I later would find out was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, that was trying to help the Jews. I spared no effort in using every means possible to help, thus saving who knows how many Jews." So what were the means that my father used? The Jews had been placed in a desperate plight. To render Germany and Austria Judenrein, or cleansed of Jews, the Nazis created draconian bureaucratic measures which combined economic expropriation and forced deportation, a system that was perfected in 1938 by Adolf Eichmann, who later became one of the architects of the final solution. Jews were told by Nazi authorities that they could leave, and their loved ones would be released from detention or concentration camps if they could produce proof of emigration. In other words, that they had someplace to go. That was not the only hoop Jews had to jump through. This was an emigration chart produced by the Kultusgemeinde, or the Jewish community of Vienna, by order of the Nazis, which depicts the maze of bureaucratic steps. There are about 120. And agencies that Jews were subjected to between May 1938 and March 1941. But as daunting as the Nazi-instituted bureaucratic immigration process was, it paled in comparison to the difficulties of finding a place to emigrate to, as evidenced by the Evian Conference in July of 1938, where most Western nations closed their doors to Jewish refugees. The Swiss, for example, as a neutral country, even demanded that Jews be identified by a red J stamped on their passports, such as this one belonging to Lottie Lustig, who was 11 at the time, in order to bar Jews from fleeing across their border. Lottie's father acquired an American telephone directory, and Lottie wrote to all the people in that phone book who had the same last name, Lustig, asking them to sponsor her family to the US. Nobody agreed to do so. So Lottie and her family were finally able to escape to Shanghai with my father's help. That's Lottie with her husband, Alan Marcus, at their home in Carmel, California in 2008. It was at this time that diplomats like my father, by using their special status as the representative of a foreign nation, were in a unique position to save large numbers of Jews by allowing them entry into their countries. All the foreign consulates in Vienna were besieged by desperate Jewish visa applicants day after day, but most did not offer help. That is the Polish consulate in Vienna, and that is the American consulate in Vienna. This led to some bitter refugee humor. One joke called Witz, or the Globe, told of a Jew who went to a travel agency shortly after the Anschluss. He inquires about emigration. The agent brings up several countries, which are promptly discounted. One requires an exorbitant amount of money, another requires a labor permit, a third does not admit immigrants, and so on. While the two men are reviewing the diminishing options, they twirl a globe on the desk. Finally, the desperate Jew asks, "Haven't you got another globe?" There was one foreign diplomat who stepped forward to help Jewish refugees at that time. But unlike his peers, he faced the most daunting obstacles as the representative of China in 1938. The first daunting obstacle my father faced was accessibility to China. The previous year, in 1937, Japan had invaded his home country and occupied all its ports of entry. Any visa he issued would be useless for entry into China, as the Japanese occupiers would certainly not recognize any document issued by a Chinese diplomat. But there was one loophole: the port city of Shanghai. The Japanese invaded Shanghai in August of 1937, driving out the Chinese government and its port authority, which left the harbor totally unmanned. It was the only entry point into China that the Japanese occupiers did not exert control over because of the objections of the other foreign imperialist powers in the city. So there was no immigration or passport control. Anybody could land ashore without showing any papers or a passport. My father took full advantage of this situation and devised an ingenious strategy: issuing entry visas to the one place, Shanghai, China, which required no visa for entry. This intentional off-label use of a standard entry visa provided the proof of immigration required by Nazi authorities to allow safe passage out of Nazi-occupied territories and release from detention. That's Shanghai Visa serial number 3681, signed personally by my father, issued on July 3rd, 1939, to Dr. Hugo Weiss. Dr. Weiss was released from Dachau on the strength of this visa and escaped to Shanghai, with his family. He later went to the unoccupied interior part of China to serve in a wartime hospital. This is a hospital. This is a photo of the hospital in Kunming, Yunnan province in Western China. And it's at a nursing school graduation in 1944. And that's Dr. Weiss and his family sitting in the middle with his son Daniel, who was born in China, on his lap. As word spread, long lines of visa applicants began to form around the Chinese consulate in Vienna. One such applicant was Hans Kraus. This is what his late wife, Gerda Gottlieb Kraus, said about how Hans obtained visas for himself and his family. He was 19 years old at the time. There were long, long lines in front of the Chinese consulate, and while people were waiting, Nazi hoodlums were outside harassing them and beating them up. There were so many people that Hans stood in line for many days, wondering when he would be able to get in. One day, he saw the Chinese consul general's car pull up to the consulate door. He saw that the car window was open, so he thrust his visa application papers through the open car window. Apparently, the consul general received them because Hans then got a call and was told that the visas were ready days later. Gerda Gottlieb met Hans Kraus in China. They were married there in Shanghai and later emigrated to Vancouver, Canada. Another use for the Shanghai visas was to get into otherwise inaccessible countries on the pretext of transiting through them on the way to Shanghai. My father said the visas were to Shanghai in name only. In reality, they're a means to help Jews leave Austria and to eventually find a way to the US, Britain, or other preferred destinations. This is 3-year-old Hetty Derlester's family spent the war in the Philippines. Hetty's father, Fritz Haidushka, was arrested by the Nazis shortly after the Anschluss. Her mother, Margaret, first obtained a Shanghai visa to present to the Gestapo as proof of immigration in order to spring her husband, and later got a Shanghai visa for herself and Hetty. With these visas, they made their way to the Philippines, and after the war, settled in San Francisco. That's Hetty at her grandson's bar mitzvah. As the usefulness of the Shanghai visas became known, other Jewish refugees, such as these teenagers, used them to sneak into Palestine on illegal transports such as the Sakarya in 1939. That young girl in the far corner here is Lily Lilienthal, the 12-year-old daughter of a prominent Viennese Jewish family. Just to give you a glimpse of the wealthy and cultured society that Vienna had been, Lilith and her older sister, Ricarda, boarded a scavenged ship for the harsh and hazardous journey, wearing white gloves and toting hat boxes. By 1939, the very use of the name Shanghai as a destination provided a means of escape from certain death at the hands of the Nazis. My father's actions in Vienna put the Chinese port city on the map as a refuge of last resort. Some 18,000 European Jewish refugees would flee to Shanghai between 1938 and 1940, and among them were Eric Golstab and his extended family. For most European Jews like 17-year-old Eric, China, and much less Shanghai, was simply unheard of. But after knocking on the doors of 50 consulates in Vienna and being turned down by them all, Eric ended up at my father's consulate, where he obtained 20 visas for himself and his extended family. Before their departure, Eric and his father were arrested and imprisoned by the Nazis on Kristallnacht. Because they were able to produce the Shanghai visas as proof of emigration, they were released within a few days, and the family embarked on their journey to Shanghai in December of 1938. On the way, Eric took a picture of a fellow Jewish passenger on the ship. The ship was entirely made up of Jewish refugees. Eric Golstab was the first survivor I found in 1997, and the first one who gave me an inkling that my father had helped more people than just his friend, Mr. Rosenberg. Eric passed away at age 90. When I visited him in Toronto in 2010, I had this picture taken with him and his children at the business he had started in cuckoo clocks. So, another reason my father chose Shanghai was to provide a fail-safe to Jewish refugees from other Nazi-occupied territories, such as Germany and Czechoslovakia, who had no access to his Shanghai visas in Vienna and were unable to go elsewhere. These Jewish refugees also benefited from my father's actions in Vienna, which put Shanghai on the map as a refuge requiring no entry papers, and that is a ship of refugees disembarking in the port of Shanghai. For example, Evelyn Pike Rubin's family was from Breslau, Germany, and heard from relatives in Vienna about a safe haven, which required no entry documents, and so were able to escape there. As a result, the majority of Shanghai refugees were German. Only 5,000 to 6,000 were Austrian, as most Austrians who were able to obtain and use my father's Shanghai visas made their way to preferred destinations. After my father's story came to light, the two questions I'm asked the most are, how many visas did he issue? And how many lives did he save? Well, I'm afraid the answer to both those questions, after more than 8 decades, is that we have no way of finding an exact figure. There was no Schindler's List. The best we can determine now is that there were thousands of visas issued based on the serial numbers of some still existing visas and the only surviving documentation from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which said that the Chinese consulate in Vienna issued an average of 400 to 500 visas a month to Jewish refugees in the 2 years after the Anschluss. So you do the math. Besides the visas, the Chinese consulate also issued other documents to help people who had no passports into which a visa could be stamped. Herb Owens and his father were one such example. That's 12-year-old Herb standing in front of his house watching Hitler march into Vienna in March 1938. Herb's father was subsequently arrested on Kristallnacht and deported to Dachau. Herb had lost his mother, so he ended up with some distant relatives where he learned about Shanghai. So this brave 12-year-old kid went to the Chinese consulate to obtain a Shanghai visa for his father. They asked me for a passport, Herb recalled years later. I told them I didn't have one because my father was in Dachau. So they gave me a written affidavit which said they would issue a visa to my father as soon as a passport is produced and told me to take that to the Gestapo. A few weeks later, Herb's father was freed. They did not end up in Shanghai, but in the United States, because by then their sponsorship from American relatives finally came through. Another example was the late Arthur Kurteman, who was arrested on Kristallnacht and deported to Dachau concentration camp. This is Arthur's mugshot from Dachau. While in Dachau, Arthur heard that a Shanghai visa would free him, so every month he wrote to his family to get him one. What they got him was the same kind of affidavit promising the issuing of a Shanghai visa, and that was enough to get him released. Arthur then went on to England, where he applied to come to the US under the British quota. Once here, he ended up serving in the US Army and was stationed to post-war Berlin, where he was able to take a photo of the stretcher that bore Hitler's body out of the bunker. So as to how many lives were saved, even my father never knew. Each visa was stamped into a passport. The passport could have been that of one individual, that of a mother and her children, or even that of an entire family. So it's really difficult to keep an individual count. There was another major obstacle at the time that my father faced. His home government in the wartime capital of Chongqing had long maintained diplomatic and economic relations with Germany. But by 1938, Hitler had turned towards Japan, Germany's soon-to-be ally, and relations with China had deteriorated. In desperation, Vice Foreign Minister Chen Jie was dispatched to Berlin. That's him arriving in Berlin with his daughter. He was dispatched to Berlin as the new ambassador to try to salvage relations. Chen ordered my father to desist from issuing visas to Jews in order not to appear to be contravening Hitler's policies. But my father did not obey and continued to do so. In April 1939, a year after he began issuing Shanghai visas, my father was punished with a demerit for his disobedience, and the year after that, transferred out of Vienna. Now, shortly before this, the Nazis confiscated the consulate building at 3 Beethovenplatz on the pretext that it was Jewish-owned. Not only did my father's home government fail to protest this breach of the Geneva Diplomatic Convention of Extraterritoriality, but refused my father's request for moving expenses. My father found a much smaller apartment nearby at 22 Johannesgasse and got a small discount on the rent because the Jewish landlady had seen what he had been doing around the corner. My father reopened the consulate there and paid all the expenses himself. In 2015, 77 years after my father first began his rescue activities there, we were able to place a commemorative plaque at 3 Beethovenplatz, which is now part of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Vienna. Now, there's the Israeli ambassador and the Chinese ambassador, a representative from my father's hometown, and this guy in the far right, I have never figured out who he is, but anyway, he's in the picture. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my father. I'm often asked what would prompt a man from China to save Jews in Austria when others would not. My immediate response has been, if you knew my father, you wouldn't have to ask, but of course that's no longer possible. What I can tell you is that my father was a man who strove to live his life according to the best in Confucian and Judeo-Christian values. He was born into poverty in rural China in 1901 during the Qing dynasty. That is a road to his home village, which has now been paved because he became famous. So the villagers managed to get money to pave the road. He lost his father at age 7. He and his family were helped by the Norwegian Missionary Society in his hometown of Iyang in Hunan province. He was educated in their schools. That's the middle school he went to. And because of his scholastic brilliance, was given a scholarship to the elite college of Yale in China in the provincial capital of Changsha. Graduated in 1926. Subsequently, he obtained a PhD in political economics from the University of Munich, graduating magna cum laude in 1932. And it was in Munich where he first saw the rise of Adolf Hitler. In 1935, my father joined the Foreign Service of the Chinese national government with a posting to Ankara, Turkey, thus beginning a 40-year diplomatic career and one that led him to Vienna, Austria in 1937. My father always felt that he had received a full measure of gifts. He was brilliant, fearless, charming, dynamic. He was also incorruptible, straightforward, and conscientious. He possessed a very hot temper, which I always attributed to his love for the very hot peppers of his native Hunan province. It sort of got him overheated. Among his most defining traits was his generosity of spirit. But more importantly, my father believed that these gifts were not bestowed upon him solely for his personal benefit, but for that of his fellow man. He expressed this in a poem he wrote on New Year's Day, 1947, which he dedicated to my mother, Shaoyong Huang Ho. That's my mom next to him. That's the poem in his calligraphy. It says, "The gifts heaven bestows are not by chance. The conviction of heroes not lightly formed. Today I gather all spirit and strength, urging my steed forward 10,000 li. A li is a Chinese measure of distance, and they're 13 li to a mile. There's another facet which bears mention, and that is my father came from a generation who felt that China had been humiliated and persecuted by 100 years of foreign imperialism. This generation was determined not to allow that humiliation to continue. So in that sense, my father was very sensitive to the persecution and to the bullying of any peoples. Throughout his life, my father stood by his convictions and refused to renounce his principles for the sake of political expediency or even personal safety, and he bore the consequences without complaint. He neither sought nor received recognition for his deeds during his lifetime. The ancient Chinese say, 善与人见不是真善, which means that if you do a good deed for show, it's not really a good deed. My father was never reunited with any of the people he had helped. They did not even know his name. I have had the good fortune to be able to find and to meet some of the people that he had helped. It's very special for me to meet survivors and their families because my father is gone and I feel as if he somehow lives on through them. So I consider them what in Chinese we call my mishpucha, or in Hebrew, my qingren, in English, my family. In 2000, my father was recognized posthumously by Israel as a righteous among the nations. My brother Monto and I went to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centers in Jerusalem, to receive the honor on his behalf. In 2007, that's in the Garden of the Righteous, and the woman next to me is one of the survivors, Frida Rogel. Anyway, so in 2007, 10 years after his death, I was able to fulfill my father's wish to be buried in his native soil in his beloved hometown of Yiyang in China's Hunan province. I think my father would have been astonished by all the accolades that he has since received. His reason for helping Jewish refugees was simply this. He said, seeing the tragic plight of the Jews, it is only natural to feel deep compassion for them, and from a humanitarian standpoint, to be impelled to help them. In other words, he did it because he saw them as fellow human beings, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, politics, or gender. I found that that's one of the defining characteristics that many rescuers like my father share, and that is the capacity to transcend diverse backgrounds and cultures to realize a potential that we all possess, which is to fully exercise our humanity. Now more than ever, that capacity is crucial as we face a rising tide of divisiveness, intolerance, hatred, and extremism, both at home and abroad, which increasingly echoes what my father faced more than 80 years ago when the Nazis exercised a racial ideology which led to the murder of 6 million Jews and 5 million others. And the Japanese Empire, with their ideology of racial superiority, killed and subjugated millions throughout the Pacific, committing such atrocities as the rape of Nanjing in China and the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. Obviously, we can't all be my father, but what I hope is that through his example, we can raise awareness that the isms, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, this targeting of the other, which is the tool used in other isms, fascism, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism, to exert power and control. No. This has become more and more normalized here in the most diverse of nations, where every one of us, except the Native Americans, is from away. Racism, for example, is not only defined by ethnic slurs, by what you read in the headlines, or by the searing violence I covered as a newspaper reporter on the front lines of the Boston school desegregation crisis in the 1970s. So too is sexism. They are embedded now in our daily lives as we go about our normal business. Unfortunately, I can personally attest to this. Just this past year, I was racially and sexually harassed while trying to do my daily therapeutic exercise at a community pool here in Maine. It began with one individual who singled me out the moment he saw me. Despite my repeated warnings to him to leave me alone, he continued to prey on me, from taunting to grabbing to stalking to obstructing me from doing my laps. My harasser has not treated any other woman in the pool this way because they are white. They look like his mother, his wife, his sister, and his daughter. I do not. My harasser has not been held to account for his egregious behavior, whereas when I sought help, I was met with skepticism, dismissal, hostility, and blame. When the schoolyard bully's actions go unchecked, it gives permission for others to pile on. The others in this case are largely women who have joined forces with my harasser because he is harassing a woman of a different race who is considered so uppity as to exercise near them, despite being told repeatedly that she does not own the pool. As to the rest of those who have witnessed this harassment, they stay as far away as possible from both my harasser and from me. They don't want to get involved out of fear of getting hurt. I get that. But they are what in Holocaust history are called the bystanders. Perhaps it's harder for those who have never been part of a targeted group to recognize all the hallmarks of the isms, but they are there, and like an insidious cancer, if left untreated, will metastasize into what ends up in the headlines. By the same token, it's harder for those who have never lived under authoritarian or fascist rule to recognize the emotional manipulation and machinations that demagogues employ to exert power and control. We simply cannot afford to be bystanders. We can't look the other way, especially in critical times such as these. I leave you with what the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller wrote under Nazism about the price of silence and of looking the other way. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out.